Emily Turner clenched the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the cracked leather, as her old sedan shuddered and sputtered before coasting to a halt on the side of the highway. Outside, the sun burned high and bright, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirage. She sat in the silence that followed, her heart pounding in frustration. "This can't be happening," she whispered, pressing her forehead against the wheel. She was already running late to her second job, a cashier shift at a local grocery store. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped keep the lights on and food in the fridge of her modest apartment. The strain of juggling rent, utilities, and student loans had left her barely scraping by. Her car, a hand-me-down from years ago, had been an act of defiance against her father's offers of help. She'd promised herself she could make it on her own. But now, with the engine dead and her options limited, she felt the weight of that promise pressing down on her. Pushing open the door, she stepped into the relentless heat, squinting at the long stretch of empty road. Emily fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling as she opened her banking app. The numbers were worse than she feared, barely enough to cover rent and groceries. A repair bill wasn't just out of reach, it was laughable. Her gaze lingered on the contact saved as Dad. She could almost hear his voice, calm and measured, offering to send help if she'd only ask. But asking meant admitting that her grand experiment in independence had failed, and her pride wasn't ready for that. Instead, she searched for nearby mechanics, scanning the results until a name caught her eye: Hayes Auto Repair. The reviews described a small, family-run shop known for honesty and fair prices. It wasn't much to go on, but it was better than nothing. With a deep breath, Emily dialed the number. The voice that answered was warm, steady, and reassuring. "Hayes Auto Repair, this is Daniel." After explaining her situation, she braced herself for the inevitable suggestion of a tow truck she couldn't afford. But instead, Daniel said, "Sounds like a tough spot. Don't worry, I'll send my truck over and take a look." "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking. "Hang tight," he replied. True to his word, a battered tow truck arrived less than 20 minutes later, pulling up beside her car with a rumble. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands marked by years of grease and calluses. His face was weathered but kind as he broke into a smile and extended a hand. "You must be Emily," he said. "I'm Daniel Hayes. Let's get this sorted out." Grateful and slightly embarrassed, she shook his hand and watched as he set to work with quiet efficiency, hooking up her car to the tow truck. "Hop in," he said, gesturing to the passenger seat. The ride to the shop was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Emily couldn't help but glance at Daniel. There was something calming about him, a quiet confidence that made her feel a little less alone. "Rough day?" he asked. "You could say that," she replied, managing a weak smile. "Well," he said, his tone light, "at least it's not raining." She chuckled despite herself, and the tension in her shoulders eased just a little. The shop came into view, a red and white building nestled behind a row of maples. It wasn't flashy, but it was tidy and welcoming. Inside, the air smelled of motor oil and coffee, and the waiting area was modest but clean, with well-worn chairs and a bulletin board filled with thank you notes and family photos. Daniel guided her to a seat before disappearing into the garage with her car. "Let me take a look," he said. Emily sat, the anxiety creeping back in as she tried to focus on an old magazine. What if the repairs were too expensive? What if her car was beyond saving? She couldn't bring herself to call her father, but she couldn't afford to lose her transportation either. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel returned, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression was thoughtful but not grim, and Emily's heart jumped in her chest. "Good news," he said. "It's your alternator. Not great, but not the worst thing in the world. I can fix it pretty quick." Emily nodded, steeling herself. "How much will it cost?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated, studying her face. "Tell you what," he said gently. "Let me fix it, and we'll figure out the rest later." Her cheeks flushed with a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. You're not, he interrupted, his voice firm but kind. Sometimes people just need a little help. I've been there myself. Don't worry about it. Emily's throat tightened, and she could only nod. True to his word, the repair didn't take long. When he handed her the keys, he said, "All set. You're good to go." She reached for her wallet, fumbling to pull out the few bills she had. "Please, at least let me give you something." Daniel shook his head. "Consider it on the house," he said. "If you want to repay me, take care of yourself. That's all I ask." Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. As she drove away, the hum of the engine was a soothing reminder of the burden that had been lifted. Glancing in the rearview mirror, she saw the shop fading into the distance, but Daniel's kindness lingered, filling her with a quiet resolve. "I'll pay it forward," she whispered to herself. She didn't know how or when, but Emily vowed to return the kindness that had saved her. What she couldn't have guessed was that her promise would set in motion a series of events that would change her life. The next morning, as Emily woke, the sun peeked over the horizon. Her mind was still swirling with the events of the previous day. She had never felt so humbled and so inspired at the same time. Daniel's quiet generosity had stuck with her, a reminder that the world wasn't as cold and indifferent as it often seemed. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the sparse apartment she called home. The peeling wallpaper, mismatched furniture, and squeaky floorboards spoke of her struggle to stay afloat. But today, for the first time in a while, she felt hope. Emily rummaged through her desk drawer, pulling out a notepad and a pen. She scribbled a list of ideas, crossing out most of them before settling on one, helping Daniel's business grow. It wasn't much, but she had a talent for design, and she could at least give something back to the man who had helped her so selflessly. Later that afternoon, she returned to Hayes Auto Repair, her laptop in hand. The shop was buzzing with activity, the air filled with the sound of tools clinking and engines rumbling. Daniel was bent over the hood of a car, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Emily," he said, looking up and smiling as she approached. "Everything okay with the car?" "It's perfect," she said. "But I wanted to thank you properly. I have something that might help." Curious, Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and followed her to the small waiting area. She opened her laptop, showing him a digital flyer she had designed. It featured a photo of the shop, a tagline about honesty and quality, and glowing testimonials she had gathered from online reviews. "This is amazing," Daniel said, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. "You did this? I couldn't afford to pay you back for the repair, so I thought this might be a way to repay your kindness," she said, her cheeks flushing slightly. "You didn't have to do this," he said, shaking his head. "I wanted to," Emily insisted. "Your shop deserves to be known. More people should see what you do." Daniel studied the flyer for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said. "This means a lot." With his blessing, Emily printed the flyers and began distributing them around town. She left stacks at coffee shops, pinned them to community boards, and even handed them out at local events. Slowly but surely, the calls began to come in. A week later, Emily stopped by the shop to check in. To her delight, she found the waiting area full of customers, and Daniel grinning as he greeted each one. "I think you might have started something," Daniel said as she approached. Emily laughed. "Looks like business is booming." "It's more than that," Daniel said, his tone serious. "I don't just want to fix cars. I want to help people. And now, thanks to you, I'm able to reach more folks who need it." Her heart swelled at his words. "You helped me when I needed it most," she said. "This is the least I could do." Over the next few weeks, Emily continued to stop by the shop, helping where she could and finding ways to connect with the community. As the business grew, so did her friendship with Daniel. He became a sounding board for her frustrations and a source of wisdom when she felt lost. One crisp fall morning, Emily arrived at the shop to find an unfamiliar car in the lot. It was sleek, black, and undeniably expensive. Her stomach twisted when she saw the man standing beside it, her father, Charles Turner, pacing near the entrance. His expression was as stern as she remembered. She froze, unsure whether to approach or retreat, but before she could decide, Daniel stepped out of the garage and greeted him with a handshake. "Good morning," Daniel said. "How can I help you?" Charles nodded, his gaze sharp and assessing. "I hear you helped my daughter with her car." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Charles turned to her, his stern expression softening slightly. "I've been trying to find you. You didn't tell me you were struggling." "I'm fine," she said quickly. "I didn't need." "You didn't need me," Charles finished for her, his voice tinged with frustration. "Emily, you're my daughter. I'm always going to care about you, whether you like it or not." Daniel watched the exchange, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Your father seems like a good man," he said quietly to Emily. "He is," she admitted, her voice low. "But we don't see eye to eye on a lot of things." Charles turned back to Daniel, his businesslike demeanor returning. "I appreciate what you did for Emily. It sounds like you've built something special here. If there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Daniel smiled, shaking his head. "I'm grateful for the offer, but I've got everything I need right here." Emily felt a pang of guilt as she watched her father nod and walk back to his car. She hadn't told him the whole truth, that she was struggling and that Daniel's kindness had been a lifeline. As the car pulled away, she realized she couldn't keep the walls between them forever. But what she didn't know was that her father had plans of his own, and Daniel Hayes was about to become a part of them. Emily spent the following days replaying her father's visit. The way he had shown up unannounced, concern etched on his face, was uncharacteristic of the man she remembered. It left her with a mixture of guilt and confusion. She had left that life behind, determined to prove she could stand on her own. But Daniel's words echoed in her mind, "Your father seems like a good man." Meanwhile, Charles Turner couldn't shake the impression Daniel had made on him. The shop owner's humility and selflessness had struck a chord. After learning more about the repair shop and the way Daniel had stepped in to help Emily without asking questions, Charles decided to act. He was a man of means and influence, but he understood the value of character better than most. A week later, Daniel was in the middle of tuning up an old pickup truck when the sleek black car returned to the lot. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside just as Charles climbed out, a folder tucked under his arm. "Morning, Mr. Turner," Daniel said, extending a hand. "What brings you by?" "Call me Charles," he replied, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. "I wanted to talk about an opportunity." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Opportunity?" Charles gestured to the waiting area. "Let's sit inside." He placed the folder on the small table and opened it. "I own a chain of luxury car dealerships," he began. "We've recently started expanding into service centers. I need someone to run operations for one of our newest locations, and I think you'd be the perfect fit." Daniel blinked, surprised. "I appreciate the offer, but this shop is my home. I've put everything into it." Charles nodded, his expression understanding. "I get it. This shop is where you've built your reputation. But the way you run things, your honesty, your care for people, that's what I want to bring to my business. This isn't just a job offer. It's a chance to make a bigger impact." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "I don't know. This place means a lot to me." "I respect that," Charles said. "I'm not asking you to abandon it. Think of this as an opportunity to grow, to take what you've built here and bring it to a larger scale." He slid a business card across the table. "Take some time to think about it. And if you decide it's not for you, no hard feelings." Charles stood, extending his hand again. "Thanks for hearing me out." Daniel shook it, still processing the unexpected offer. After Charles left, Daniel sat in the quiet shop, staring at the card. The idea of running a larger operation was daunting, but it was also tempting. The truth was, keeping Hayes Auto Repair afloat hadn't been easy. He had poured his heart and soul into the business, but there were months when he barely broke even. The next day, Emily stopped by with coffee and donuts. She found Daniel sitting in the waiting area, the business card on the table in front of him. "What's that?" she asked, setting the bag down. "Your dad came by again," Daniel said, handing her the card. "He offered me a job." Emily's eyes widened as she read it. "He did?" Daniel nodded. "Wants me to run one of his service centers. Says it's a good opportunity." "What do you think?" she asked. "I think I've got a lot to consider," he replied. "This shop is everything to me, but I've also been struggling to keep it going. This could be a way to make things easier, not just for me, but for the people I help." Emily studied his face for a moment. "I think you should consider it," she said. "My dad doesn't offer jobs to just anyone. If he sees something in you, it means something." Daniel smiled faintly. "You're starting to sound like him." "Maybe he and I aren't so different after all," she said, laughing softly. Over the next few days, Daniel wrestled with the decision. He sought advice from friends and family, weighing the pros and cons. Ultimately, he realized that accepting the offer didn't mean abandoning his values. It meant expanding them, reaching more people and building something even greater. When he called Charles to accept the position, the older man sounded genuinely pleased. "You won't regret this," Charles said. "I'll make sure of it." As Daniel hung up the phone, he felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. This new chapter was uncertain, but it was also full of possibility. What none of them knew was how profoundly this decision would shape all their lives. Daniel's first day at the new service center was a whirlwind of activity. The facility was sleek and modern, with gleaming floors and rows of advanced diagnostic equipment. It was a far cry from his cozy small-town shop. Employees bustled around in crisp uniforms, and customers sipped espresso in a waiting area that looked more like a luxury hotel lounge than an auto shop. Charles Turner was waiting for him when he arrived. "Welcome to your new headquarters," Charles said with a smile. "Let me show you around." As they walked through the building, Charles outlined his vision. "I want this place to be more than just a service center," he said. "It needs to be a beacon of trust. Customers should leave here feeling like they've been treated with respect and fairness. That's why I hired you." Daniel listened carefully, taking it all in. While the environment was vastly different from what he was used to, the values Charles described aligned perfectly with his own. It wasn't long before Daniel began to find his rhythm, blending his hands-on expertise with his new leadership role. It didn't take long for Daniel's influence to spread. One afternoon, a single mother arrived with her 2 young children, looking frazzled as she explained that her car had broken down on the way to pick up groceries. She worried aloud about the cost of repairs, her voice trembling as she tried to calm her crying toddler. Daniel knelt to the child's level, offering him a friendly smile and a toy wrench from a nearby toolbox. Then he turned to the mother. "Let me take a look," he said. He personally inspected her car and found the issue, a loose belt. It was a quick fix. When the woman nervously asked about the bill, Daniel waved it off. "It's on the house," he said. "Just pay it forward someday." The mother's gratitude was overwhelming, and the story quickly spread among customers and employees alike. Inspired by Daniel's actions, the staff began to adopt his philosophy, treating every customer with care and compassion. Emily visited the service center often, fascinated by the changes she had watched as Daniel transformed her father's vision into something deeply personal, something rooted in kindness. One evening, after the center had closed for the day, Charles invited Emily and Daniel to dinner at his estate. It was the first time Emily had set foot there since she had left, and the sight of the sprawling mansion stirred mixed emotions. The dining room was just as she remembered, grand, with a polished mahogany table that seemed to stretch endlessly. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. Her father was relaxed, his demeanor more approachable than she had seen in years. As they ate, Charles turned to Daniel. "I've been keeping an eye on how you've been running the center," he said. "You've exceeded every expectation. Revenue is up, but more importantly, customer satisfaction has never been higher. You're making an impact, and I want to thank you for that." "Thank you," Daniel said humbly. "I'm just trying to do what's right for people." Charles nodded, his gaze softening. "You know, Emily's mother used to say the same thing. She believed in helping others, no matter what." Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Her father rarely spoke of her late mother, and the unexpected mention left her both surprised and moved. "She'd be proud of both of you," Charles continued. "Proud of the values you're carrying forward." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat, but for once, it wasn't from frustration. It was from a sense of connection, a bridge forming where there had only been distance before. As the evening wound down, Charles raised a glass. "To family," he said, "and to building something that lasts." Emily and Daniel exchanged a glance, each feeling the weight of his words. Over the next several months, Daniel's leadership continued to transform the service center. He introduced free car care workshops for single parents, partnered with local charities for donation drives, and started a mentorship program for young people interested in auto mechanics. The center became more than just a business, it became a pillar of the community. Emily too found her stride. Inspired by Daniel's example, she began volunteering at a local shelter, using her design skills to create campaigns that brought in donations. Her relationship with her father slowly mended as they worked together on various projects, finding common ground they had never shared before. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel received a letter from Charles. Inside was a personal note and a check for $5,000. "Daniel," it read, "this is a small token of my appreciation for everything you've done, not just for my daughter, but for the community. You've shown me what true leadership looks like, and I'm grateful to call you a partner." Daniel stared at the check, his heart full. It wasn't just the money, it was the recognition of the values he had brought to life. As he folded the letter, he thought of Emily and the way their lives had intertwined. Kindness had brought them together, and now it was rippling outward, creating a legacy neither of them had ever imagined. Winter arrived with a crispness in the air that seemed to invigorate everything it touched. At the service center, Daniel stood outside, watching his employees chat with a family picking up their newly repaired car. The center, once just another facility in Charles Turner's business empire, had become a beacon of trust in the community. Daniel's philosophy had taken root, spreading among his staff and customers alike. Inside, Emily was seated at a small desk in the back office, finalizing the details of a community outreach initiative she had been working on for months. She had successfully secured grants to fund free vehicle repair vouchers for struggling families and launched a car care mentorship program for teens interested in the trade. Her designs were everywhere, from posters to social media campaigns that had brought attention to the center's unique mission. Daniel knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Busy?" he asked, a grin tugging at his lips. "Always," Emily said, smiling up at him. "But I think this project is finally coming together." He stepped inside and picked up one of the flyers from her desk. "You've done a lot for this place," he said. "I don't know how we'd manage without you." Emily shrugged, her expression softening. "I've just been inspired by what you've done here. Besides, this isn't just about the center. It's about helping people, just like you helped me before." Before Daniel could respond, the office phone rang. Emily answered it, her face lighting up. She recognized the voice on the other end. "It's my dad," she mouthed to Daniel before turning her attention back to the call. A few minutes later, she hung up and looked at Daniel with a mixture of surprise and excitement. "He wants us to come to the house tonight. He says it's important." That evening, as Emily and Daniel arrived at the Turner estate, they were greeted by Charles himself, who seemed unusually animated. He led them into the dining room, where a large rectangular box sat on the table, wrapped in silver paper. "What's this?" Emily asked, eyeing the package suspiciously. "A surprise," Charles said with a rare twinkle in his eye. He gestured toward Daniel. Go ahead, open it. Daniel hesitated, then carefully removed the wrapping to reveal a beautifully crafted plaque. The words engraved on it read, Hayes Community Service Center, a legacy of kindness and integrity. Daniel ran his fingers over the polished wood, his throat tightening. I don't know what to say, he murmured. There's more, Charles said, pulling out an envelope from his pocket. He handed it to Daniel, who opened it to find official documents transferring full ownership of the service center to him. This place has become something truly special, Charles said, and that's because of you. It belongs to you now. Consider it my way of saying thank you, not just for what you've done for the business, but for the way you've brought our family back together. Daniel looked at Charles, then at Emily, who was wiping tears from her eyes. I never expected this, he said. I was just trying to do the right thing. And you did, Emily said softly, in more ways than you know. The rest of the evening was spent sharing stories, laughter, and plans for the future. For the first time, Emily felt a sense of peace as she sat at the table with her father, a connection between them slowly mending with every word spoken. As they prepared to leave, Charles pulled Daniel aside. You've done more for this family than I could have imagined, he said. Thank you for being there for Emily and for showing me what true leadership looks like. It's been an honor, Daniel replied sincerely. Later that night, as Daniel locked up the center, he paused to look at the plaque now mounted in the lobby. It reflected not just his work, but the collective efforts of everyone who had been a part of the journey. What had started as a simple act of kindness had grown into something far greater, a legacy that would continue to touch lives long after the sunset on that snowy evening. And in his heart, Daniel knew that every small act of compassion, no matter how unassuming, held the power to change the world.